So it's been announced that Triple G Gennady Golovkin's next opponent is Willie Munroe Jr. I'm surprised at this. Let me tell you why I'm surprised. Willie Munroe Jr. is a fighter that I haven't seen too much of. I've watched the Brian Vera fight, I've watched a few bits and pieces from the Boxino tournament, but he's someone who's held in very high regard by the boxing community. There's been 2 or 3 regular viewers to my channel who've commented on previous videos that I should check the guy out. They think he could be the next big thing. They really like what they see with him. So I've had a little bit of look. As I say, he's not one of these fighters I've been following for years. I haven't seen all of his fights. But he's likeable, which I'll touch on in a minute. But what Willie Munroe Jr. is proven. He hasn't ever fought a top 10 middleweight. It's questionable whether he's ever fought a top 20 middleweight. With that in mind, it's hard to really consider Willie Munroe Jr. a top 15 middleweight at present, given the depth of talent there is out there. I like him. The way he fights, to me, as a boxing fan, is attractive. I think he brings a lot to the table. But he's not a big name. He's not a big name within the boxing community, and in my opinion, he's a very small name amongst the sort of casual boxing community. So what I mean is, Gennady Golovkin here is fighting a fighter who, by all accounts, is pretty good and brings a lot to the table, but at the same time doesn't have the name, doesn't have the celebrity, doesn't have the sort of appreciation amongst the fans to kind of elevate Gennady Golovkin up people's pound for pound lists and to make Gennady Golovkin more of a star, if you like. Beating Willie Munroe Jr., yeah, I'll be impressed. Boxing hardcore fans will be impressed, but to the man on the street, it's not really going to turn Golovkin into more of a superstar. So that's why I was surprised at this fight, because for me the risk-reward doesn't add up. Willie Munroe Jr. does bring some interesting things to the table. He's a slick boxer, he's a southpaw, and he's quite awkward, and there's a few difficult combinations when you add that sort of slickness combined with the southpaw stance. He's a guy who knows how to use angles, he's a guy who can make himself small, he's a guy who can lean, he's a guy who can bend, he's not an easy guy to fight, he really isn't. He's also an exceptional mover. People were critical with him in the Brian Vera fight because of how he ran around the ring. But I was really impressed about the way he could pivot, the way he could spin away from Vera, the way he could find gaps and escape when Vera came in, and I thought he looked really good. So he brings all that to the table. Now, for me, Golovkin's best victories, Macklin, Murray, Curtis Stevens, Daniel Gill, Marco Antonio Rubio, none of those guys have the slickness of Willie Munroe Jr. None of those guys are as awkward as Willie Munroe Jr. None of those guys can move as well as Munroe Jr. And it'll be interesting to see how Golovkin deals with that challenge. I would say Munroe Jr. could perhaps pose similar challenges to a Golovkin as, let's say, an Erislandy Lara. To a lesser extent, let's say an Austin Trout, let's say a Hassan Ndamanjikam. This is a real clever boxer here who can move. He understands angles, he understands making himself small. The question is, whilst he looked very, very good moving against Brian Vera, how is he going to look against Gennady Golovkin? And something I want to touch on briefly ahead of this fight is I feel that ring size could be very, very important. The Golovkin-Murray ring was noticeably tiny, and it made Golovkin, who's an expert at cutting off the ring to begin with, it made Golovkin's life a lot easier. He didn't have to move too far to get Murray up against the ropes to position him into a corner. I think ring size is really important, and if this fight, Munroe Jr. versus Golovkin, is fought in a ring of a similar size, for me, I'd strongly favour Golovkin, because I just think that Munroe is a guy who needs a bit of space, he needs a bit of room to pivot, he needs to have, gaps to exploit for his movement. So I think that's a really relevant factor that I think I want to highlight at an early stage. But I could see him causing Golovkin some problems. You know, the difficulty with Munroe Jr. is he's not a big puncher. In fact, I'd say as elite level middleweights go, he's probably below average as a puncher. He's not going to knock Golovkin out. His body punching, whilst it is in existence, it's limited. It's not overly threatening. You know, and I feel that that's a possible area of weakness for Golovkin, is his sort of vulnerability to body shots, and I think he can certainly be tagged to the body. So I think Munroe Jr., you know, he doesn't bring that power dynamic. He's not going to hurt Golovkin to the body. He's not going to knock Golovkin out, you know, with head hunting. He's also not the kind of guy who's going to put Golovkin on his back foot, you know, push Golovkin back, rough him up on the inside. He doesn't have that facet to his game. So there's a number of ways that you could potentially cause Golovkin problems. You know, big manning him, pushing him back, knocking him out, hitting him to the body. You know, I don't think Willie Munroe brings any of those to the table. I think he's awkward, and I think what we're going to see him do is we're going to see him on his back foot, we're going to see him running, we're going to see him using angles, and the question essentially is, will Willie Munroe Jr. be able to stop Golovkin cutting down the ring? Will he be able to prevent himself from ending up on the ropes? Will he be able to turn and pivot on Golovkin like he did on Brian Vera? And that's something that at present is slightly intangible. Because of that, I think ring size is really, really relevant in this fight. I see it as a hugely relevant factor. Now, I think Munroe brings such an awkwardness to the table, and he has got some offensive weapons. So his jab, I like his jab. He often sort of doubles, trebles up the jab, but in addition to having a sort of busy jab, he also throws relatively eye-catching leads. So, as I say, he's a southpaw. He throws quite a nice lead right-hand hook. He also throws quite a nice lead left-hand cross. You know, he'll often lead with his backhand. So he throws quite eye-catching lead punches with the front-hand hook and the backhand cross. And he kind of does it. He'll kind of punch and sort of hold it up. And it is, you know, it is sort of punch that looks very, very attractive. And he punches with decent accuracy. And at the same time, he's entwining that with the busy double treble jab. And he's moving, he's pivoting, he's using angles, and he's really quite stylistic and quite aesthetically pleasing how he's going about the ring. I don't think it's impossible that if he can avoid Golovkin positioning him in the corner, if he can keep the jab busy, if he can land eye-catching punches, that he could win rounds with Golovkin. Maybe if he could frustrate Golovkin, there's an outside chance Willie Munroe Jr. outpoints Golovkin. It's hard to see because, in my opinion, Golovkin hasn't fought someone with the movement and the slickness of Willie Munroe before. People say that Kazimuma, who's used similar sort of movement type tactics against him, caused Golovkin problems. Potentially, Willie Munroe Jr. will have more success being a superior fighter than Kazimuma. It would be interesting. I'm looking forward to it. I don't understand the fight from a risk-reward ratio. You know, beating Willie Munroe Jr. does very little for Golovkin. Very little. But it's a big risk. I guess Willie Munroe's not going to knock him out. I guess he's not going to put him on his back foot and rough him up. I guess he's not going to bust Golovkin to his body and break his ribs. You know, he's not a threat in that sense. But he's awkward beyond belief. He's southpaw, he's got a busy jab, he's got eye-catching punches. His movement, his pivoting really has the potential to frustrate people. And I also don't think he's the easiest guy to hit. You know, someone who understands bending at the waist, leaning backwards, you know, leaning forwards sometimes. Someone who understands those kind of angles and those kind of dynamics can always be a headache. So I think it's an interesting fight. I'm looking forward to it. Willie Munroe Jr. isn't a top 10 middleweight, but I'm confident had he taken an easier route, he would have beaten the opponents necessary to get there. I actually think it's a good fight, and I'm looking forward to it. For me, there are a few questions. Number one, size of the ring. And I think, following on from that, what's going to be the real question at work in this fight is, Will Gennady Golovkin be able to cut down the ring? Will he be able to position Munroe Jr. against the ropes? Will he be able to sort of corner Munroe Jr.? If he does that, Golovkin wins by stoppage. If Munroe frustrates Golovkin, if he can avoid being cornered, avoid getting up against the ropes, if he can, run around him, peppering him with the jab, then it gets real interesting. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks very much for watching.